Welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight we're drifting off into the history and mystery of Area 51, how it was established, conspiracy theories, and where it sits today. But before we dive in, be sure to check out the description below where you'll find resources to help you rest and sleep better naturally. Let's dive in. Somewhere in the high desert of southern Nevada, past the scorched salt flats and the ancient dry lake beds that shimmer like ghosts in the midday heat, there exists a place that the United States government spent decades insisting did not exist at all. No sign marks its boundary. No road on any public map leads you there. And yet, for nearly 70 years, it has occupied a corner of the American imagination unlike almost any other place on Earth. It has been called many things: Dreamland, Paradise Ranch, The Ranch, Watertown. But the name the world came to know it by is simple, almost mundane. A designation pulled from a grid on a Cold War map. Area 51. This is its story. To understand how Area 51 came to be, you have to travel back to a world gripped by fear. The year is 1947, and the Second World War has barely cooled. The Allied forces that stood together against the Axis powers are fracturing fast, and a new kind of tension, quieter, colder, but no less dangerous, is settling over the globe. The Soviet Union, now in possession of vast stretches of Eastern Europe, is not a partner to the West. It is a rival. And in this new rivalry, information is everything. Knowing what the Soviets were building, where they were building it, and how fast they were moving became perhaps the most urgent intelligence question of the age. The United States had aircraft. It had pilots. What it did not have in those early years of the Cold War was a reliable way to look deep inside Soviet territory from the sky, not without risking war. Sending manned aircraft over hostile airspace was an act that could spark a conflict. And so, quietly in the corridors of the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency and within the halls of American aerospace engineering, a question began to take shape. What if you could fly so high that no one could touch you? That question would eventually answer itself in the form of one of the most remarkable aircraft ever built. But the aircraft needed somewhere to be born, somewhere remote, somewhere invisible to the world, somewhere that could hold secrets the way the desert holds heat. Long after the sun goes down, you can still feel it radiating from the ground. The desert remembers, and the men who chose this particular patch of Nevada were counting on that. The story of how the site was selected begins with a man named Kelly Johnson. Johnson was no ordinary engineer. He was the creative force behind Lockheed's secretive Skunk Works division, a small, intensely talented team of aeronautical engineers who operated in deliberate isolation from the rest of the company, free from bureaucracy, free from committees, free to dream in aluminum and jet fuel. Johnson had already produced legendary aircraft. He would produce more. But in the early 1950s, his greatest challenge lay ahead of him, and it had a name: the U-2. The U-2 was to be a reconnaissance aircraft unlike anything that had flown before. It would cruise at altitudes above 70,000 feet, so high that the sky above would begin to darken toward black, so high that the pilot would need a pressure suit just to survive. At that altitude, the thinking went, no Soviet fighter could reach it. No missile could touch it. It would drift silently over cities and military installations. Its long, elegant wings, more glider than jet, carrying cameras capable of reading a newspaper headline from the edge of the stratosphere. It was an audacious idea, and to build it, test it, and fly it, Kelly Johnson needed a place where no one would ever stumble across it by accident. In the spring of 1955, Johnson and a small team flew over the Nevada desert in a small aircraft, searching. They were looking for a dry lake bed, flat, hard, natural runway material that nature had been paving for thousands of years. They found several candidates, but one stood out immediately: Groom Lake. Nestled in a valley surrounded on all sides by mountain ranges, accessible by a single rough road, and sitting inside an existing restricted zone from the atomic testing era, it was, as Johnson himself reportedly said upon seeing it, the most perfect location he could have imagined. Within weeks, the CIA had quietly acquired the land. President Eisenhower himself approved the project, a fact that would remain classified for decades. And the construction crews moved in. What rose from the desert floor was not a city, not a grand complex, but something humble, almost deliberately unimpressive from the outside. A few hangars, a control tower, dormitories, a mess hall, and that long, flat, impossibly straight runway stretching across the pale surface of the lake bed. The workers who built it were told little. The men who would work there were told less to outsiders. The base was given the unassuming designation Area 51, drawn simply from its position on a grid map of the Nevada Test and Training Range, the vast expanse of restricted desert that had been used for nuclear weapons tests since the late 1940s. There was an Area 52 nearby, and an Area 53, but it was the 51st grid square, sitting atop Groom Lake, that history chose. Whether that choice was fate or just cartography is a question no map can answer. To attract engineers and pilots to this remote, classified outpost, the base was given a different kind of name, an internal nickname meant to soften the strangeness of being asked to disappear into the desert for weeks at a time. They called it Paradise Ranch. It was, in almost every measurable sense, the opposite of paradise. The heat in summer was ferocious. The dust storms could ground operations for days. The recreational facilities were minimal. And yet, the men who came here, drawn by the pull of cutting-edge work, by the intoxicating feeling of building something that had never existed before, remember it with a kind of fondness that the word ranch almost captures. Almost. By the mid-1950s, the facility was operational. The U-2 program was underway, and Area 51 had become the most secret square mile in the United States, a place that existed on no public map, that appeared in no government budget that any ordinary citizen could examine, and that would remain, in the official language of Washington, essentially non-existent for the better part of 4 more decades. But secrets, even the most carefully guarded ones, have a way of leaking at the edges, not in dramatic revelations, but in small, quiet ways, in glimpses. In the testimony of ranch hands and farmers who looked up at the sky on clear Nevada evenings and saw lights that moved in ways they could not explain, craft that climbed too fast, turned too sharply, vanished too completely to be anything they recognized. What they were seeing, though no one told them so, was the future of American aviation being written in contrails above the desert. But they didn't know that, and in not knowing it, they would help write a very different kind of story, one that would eventually grow larger in the popular imagination than even the astonishing truth itself. That story, and the truth woven through it, is what we're here to tell. There's something almost meditative about the Nevada desert at dawn. The light arrives slowly, bleeding up from behind the mountains in shades of amber and rose, and for a few minutes the whole world seems perfectly still. No wind, no sound, just the vast, patient silence of a landscape that has been here for millions of years and will be here for millions more. It is easy, standing in that stillness, to feel very small. And it is easy to understand why the men who came to work at Groom Lake in those early years described the place as both isolating and strangely beautiful, a contradiction the desert specializes in. But by the time that dawn light reached the hangar floors in the mid-1950s, the stillness was already breaking. Engines were warming, checklists were being run, and the most secret aviation program in American history was quietly, methodically going to work. The U-2 was unlike any aircraft that had come before it. And to understand what made it so extraordinary, you have to imagine the engineering problem it was designed to solve. Conventional aircraft of the era flew at altitudes of perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 feet at their ceiling. Impressive heights, but well within the reach of Soviet radar and, increasingly, Soviet interceptor aircraft. The CIA and the Air Force needed something that could operate 10 miles higher than that. Not 5 miles higher, not 6, 10. They needed to push a manned aircraft into a region of the atmosphere so thin, so cold, so brutal that the engineering challenges multiplied at every turn. The wings had to be enormous, long and slender like a sailplane's, generating lift in air, so sparse it barely qualified as air at all. The engine had to breathe at altitudes where there was almost nothing to breathe. The pilot had to wear a full pressure suit because at 70,000 feet, without pressurization, the blood in his body would begin to boil. These were not theoretical concerns. They were daily realities for the test pilots who strapped themselves into the U-2 on the pale surface of Groom Lake and pointed its nose at the sky. Those pilots were a particular kind of human being, selected from the finest aviators the Air Force had to offer. They were quietly approached, quietly recruited, and quietly asked to resign their military commissions so that they could fly for the CIA as civilians. A legal fiction designed to provide the government with a thin layer of deniability in case anything went wrong over Soviet territory. They were given new identities for the purposes of their work. They were told, with great seriousness, that if they were ever shot down or captured, the United States government would deny all knowledge of them and of the program they flew for. It was not a comforting briefing. They accepted it anyway, because men like these did not easily say no to a challenge, and because whatever fear they carried quietly. The early test flights at Groom Lake produced immediate problems and immediate wonders in roughly equal measure. The U-2 was, to put it plainly, a difficult aircraft to fly. It was deeply sensitive to airspeed. Too fast and the wings would suffer, too slow and the aircraft would stall, and at its operating altitude, the margin between those two conditions was so narrow that pilots called it the coffin corner. The landing gear was unusual, a bicycle-style configuration with small outrigger wheels that would fall away at takeoff, requiring the pilot to balance the aircraft on a single center line as he touched down, the long wings dipping to one side and then the other until the plane rolled to a stop. It was, by all accounts, one of the most demanding aircraft to land ever built. The pilots practiced the landing endlessly on the flat, forgiving surface of Groom Lake. But when the U-2 worked, and it worked magnificently, it was a revelation. In the summer of 1955, the first successful high-altitude test flights were completed above the Nevada desert. And almost immediately, something unexpected happened. Air traffic controllers at commercial airports across California and Nevada began receiving reports from airline pilots who had seen something extraordinary. A silver object, cruising at impossible altitude, catching the last light of the setting sun long after the sky below had gone dark. Some of the airline crews, their voices carrying a note of genuine confusion, were describing something they had no frame of reference for. Because there was no frame of reference, nothing flew that high, nothing that any of them had ever heard of anyway. The reports filtered into the network of UFO sightings that had been quietly accumulating since the late 1940s. This is where the history of Area 51 begins to split into two parallel tracks: the classified track of genuine aerospace achievement and the public track of rumor, mystery, and eventually mythology. The CIA was aware almost immediately that the U-2 flights were generating UFO reports. Internal documents, declassified decades later, show that analysts estimated more than half of all UFO sightings reported over the United States in the late 1950s were, in fact, U-2 aircraft catching the sunlight at altitude. The government knew this. It cannot say so. And so the mystery deepened, year by year, flight by flight, while the truth sat inside a classified file cabinet at Langley. Meanwhile, the U-2 was being prepared for its real mission. In July of 1956, the first operational overflight of Soviet territory took place. A single aircraft, piloted by a CIA contractor, crossed into Soviet airspace from an Allied base in Western Europe and photographed military installations deep inside Russia. The mission was a stunning success. The photographs were processed, analyzed, and delivered to President Eisenhower within days. What they revealed, the state of Soviet air bases, the positioning of bomber fleets, the early stages of missile development, was intelligence of a quality and quantity that no other collection method could have produced. Eisenhower reportedly looked at the images for a long time without speaking. The Soviets, for their part, tracked the U-2 on radar from the very first overflight. They knew something was up there. They simply could not reach it. Their fighters climbed to their maximum ceilings and still fell thousands of feet short. Their surface-to-air missiles, in those early years, were not yet capable of the altitude required. And so the overflights continued, month after month, year after year. Over Moscow, over Leningrad, over the vast industrial complexes of the Soviet interior, while the pilots flew in their pressurized suits in near silence, surrounded by the thin dark blue of the upper atmosphere, and the cameras turned below them recording everything. Back at Groom Lake, the rhythm of the base had settled into something almost routine, if any part of living a double life in the Nevada desert can be called routine. The personnel who worked there, engineers, mechanics, pilots, support staff, were transported in and out on unmarked aircraft, flying from a dedicated terminal at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas that had no signs, no posted schedules, and no acknowledgement of its own existence in any public record. The flights were known informally as the Janet flights, named for the call sign used by the aircraft, though the origin of that name remains, like so much else connected to this place, somewhat murky. Workers received their paychecks, lived their lives, and said nothing to their families about where they spent their working weeks. Wives raised children alone through the week and asked few questions. It was the culture of the era, and it was the culture of this particular secret, and the two fit together with an almost painful neatness. By the late 1950s, though, the world around Area 51 was changing in ways that would soon force a reckoning. The Soviet missile program was advancing. The comfortable altitude advantage that had protected the U-2 was beginning to erode at the edges. And in the spring of 1960, the day that Eisenhower and the CIA had quietly dreaded finally arrived. On May 1st, May Day, a U-2 piloted by a man named Francis Gary Powers was struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile over the city of Sverdlovsk, deep inside Russia. Powers survived the shoot-down. He was captured, and the entire edifice of deniability that the program had been built upon came apart in the span of a few days, as the Soviets displayed the wreckage, displayed the pilot, and watched the United States government tie itself in knots trying to explain what its civilian weather research aircraft had been doing over the Soviet heartland. It was a crisis. It ended the Paris summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev before it had properly begun. It deepened the Cold War chill at precisely the moment when a thaw had seemed possible, and it meant that the U-2, at least in its original role as a Soviet overflight platform, was finished. But Area 51 was not finished, not even close, because even as the U-2 program was navigating its very public collapse, the engineers and dreamers at Groom Lake were already working on something new. Something faster, something so far beyond the U-2 that the U-2 would seem, in retrospect, like a stepping stone to a shore that barely anyone had imagined. They were building an aircraft that would fly at 3 times the speed of sound, that would cross continents in hours, that would outrun any missile ever fired at it simply by going faster than the missile could follow. They were building the future, and they were building it as they built everything at Groom Lake in secret. There's a moment, pilots say, when you cross the sound barrier, when the aircraft punches through that invisible wall of compressed air and the world behind you goes quiet in a way that feels almost personal, almost deliberate, as though the sky itself has decided to stop arguing with you and simply let you through. At twice the speed of sound, the sensation deepens. The ground below becomes abstract, a patchwork of color and geometry that no longer feels entirely real. At 3 times the speed of sound, pilots who have been there describe something closer to a philosophical experience, a sense of having left the ordinary world so completely behind that returning to it requires a conscious act of will. The men who flew out of Groom Lake in the early 1960s knew that feeling intimately, because the aircraft they were flying was not supposed to be possible. To understand how it came to exist, you have to go back to the aftermath of the power shootdown and the particular kind of institutional panic that follows a very public intelligence failure. The U-2 was compromised. That much was clear. What was needed was something that could not be compromised, not because it flew higher, necessarily, but because it flew so fast that by the time any defensive system could react to its presence, it would already be gone. A ghost that moved too quickly to be haunted. Kelly Johnson and his Skunk Works team had actually begun thinking about this problem before the Powers incident, back in the late 1950s, under a CIA program with a deliberately forgettable code name Oxcart. The challenge they had set themselves was almost incomprehensible in its ambition. They wanted to build an aircraft that could cruise, not sprint, but cruise continuously at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, roughly 2,200 miles per hour at altitude, fast enough to cross the continental United States in about 70 minutes. Fast enough that the kinetic friction of the air against the aircraft's skin would heat the exterior surfaces to temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit during sustained flight. That last fact drove almost every design decision that followed, because no aircraft had ever been built to withstand the kind of sustained thermal stress. The aluminum that formed the skeleton and skin of virtually every aircraft in existence at the time would simply soften and fail at those temperatures. New materials were needed, new manufacturing processes, new ways of thinking about what an aircraft was and what it could be asked to endure. The answer, arrived at after years of engineering struggle, was titanium, strong, lightweight, and capable of withstanding extreme heat. Titanium was the only material that made sense. There was, however, a problem, a deeply ironic one, given the context. The United States did not produce enough titanium domestically to build the aircraft in the quantities needed. The world's largest known deposits of the ore from which titanium was refined lay inside the Soviet Union. And so, through a network of front companies and third-party brokers carefully constructed by the CIA, the United States government secretly purchased titanium from the Soviet Union to build a spy plane designed to fly over the Soviet Union. The Soviets, apparently, never connected the transactions to the program. It is one of the quiet, almost comedic footnotes of the Cold War, the adversary unknowingly supplying the means of its own surveillance. The aircraft that emerged from this process was designated the A-12, and it was extraordinary in ways that went beyond its speed. It was long and narrow, with a fuselage that tapered to something almost blade-like at the nose. It had two massive engines mounted in pods on the wings, and those wings swept back at a sharp angle that gave the whole aircraft the look of something that had evolved rather than been designed, as though nature itself had spent a few million years working on the aerodynamics problem, and this was the result. It was painted a very dark blue, almost black, chosen not for stealth in the modern radar-absorbing sense, but because dark surfaces radiated heat more efficiently, helping manage the enormous thermal load the aircraft accumulated during high-speed flight. That color would give its successor a name that has become one of the most famous in aviation history. But that comes later. The A-12 first flew at Groom Lake on April 26, 1962. The pilot was a Lockheed test pilot named Lou Schock, and by several accounts the aircraft became briefly airborne slightly before Schock intended it to. The desert surface of Groom Lake rushing past, the aircraft lifting of its own accord, as though it were simply impatient. Schock brought it back down almost immediately, made some adjustments, and took it up properly. What followed over the next several months was a test program of ferocious intensity, pushing the aircraft further and faster with each successive flight, chasing the performance envelope toward its theoretical limits and occasionally beyond them. The men who flew the A-12 were, like the U-2 pilots before them, a specific and remarkable type. They were recruited with the same quiet approach, the same resigned military commissions, the same civilian cover stories. They were told the same hard truths about deniability, and they accepted those terms with the same matter-of-fact courage. But the A-12 asked something additional of its pilots. It asked them to fly an aircraft so new, so unproven, and so extreme in its performance that the test flights themselves carry a mortality rate that the program's managers tracked with grim attention. Several pilots were killed during the A-12 test program, their deaths attributed in public records to accidents involving aircraft whose existence could not be acknowledged. Families received condolences without context. They buried men who had, officially, been doing nothing dangerous at all. Inside the fence at Groom Lake, though, the losses were felt with full weight. These were tight communities, small groups of people who lived and worked in close proximity, who ate in the same mess hall and walked the same desert paths at the end of long days, who knew one another with the particular intimacy that shared secrecy creates. When someone did not come back from a flight, the grief was real and it was present, and it had nowhere to go except inward, because there was no public ceremony, no newspaper notice, no way to mourn that the outside world could see. While the A-12 was being developed and refined, the base itself was evolving. The original modest collection of hangars and dormitories had grown into something more substantial, though it was still, by the standards of most military installations, a spare and functional place. The runway had been extended to accommodate the A-12's demanding performance requirements. New radar facilities had been added, the security perimeter had expanded, and the culture of the base had deepened into something with its own particular character. Rigorous, secretive, proud, and shot through with the particular black humor that people develop when they spend a great deal of time doing genuinely dangerous things that no one outside the fence will ever hear about. The A-12 became operational for reconnaissance missions in 1967, flying over North Vietnam and North Korea to gather intelligence that no other platform could provide. Its speed proved as protective as its designers had hoped. On every operational mission the aircraft flew, it returned safely. Nothing could catch it. Nothing could touch it. It was, in purely operational terms, everything the program had promised. And yet, even as the A-12 was proving itself in the field, it was already being superseded. The Air Force, which had been watching the CIA's program with a mixture of admiration and institutional jealousy, had commissioned its own variant, a two-seat version, larger and even more capable, designed not just for reconnaissance, but eventually adapted for other roles as well. This aircraft would carry a different designation. It would carry that famous black paint that the A-12 had pioneered, and it would carry a name, the State Route 71 Blackbird. That would become, over the decades that followed, perhaps the most celebrated aircraft designation in history. But the Blackbird, for all its fame, was in many ways the public face of something that had already been accomplished in secret at Groom Lake. The harder work, the more dangerous work, the work done in the full darkness of classification without any prospect of acknowledgement. That work belonged to the A-12 and to the men who flew it. They were, in the truest sense, the pioneers. And most of the world would not know their names for another 30 years. It is worth pausing here, in the middle of this story, to notice something about the pattern that was forming. Again and again, the classified achievements at Groom Lake were generating unexplained phenomena in the world outside the fence. The U-2 flights had produced a wave of UFO reports in the late 1950s. Now the A-12, with its extraordinary speed, its unusual shape, and its tendency to catch the light in strange ways at altitude, was producing its own wave. Witnesses across Nevada and the surrounding states were reporting objects that moved with impossible speed, that left no sonic boom they could explain, because the aircraft was already miles away before the sound reached them, and that maneuvered, or appeared to maneuver, in ways that defied the logic of anything they had seen before. The government could not correct these reports without confirming the program's existence. And so the reports accumulated. The stories grew. People who had genuinely seen something real, something extraordinary, in fact, were left without an explanation. And in the absence of explanation, imagination filled the space. It always does. It is one of the most human things there is, and one of the most consequential. And at Groom Lake, it was happening on a scale and with an intensity that would eventually produce something the original architects of the base could never have anticipated. But that story, the story of what the mythology became and why, belongs to a later chapter. For now, it is enough to sit with the image of those early morning flights above the Nevada desert. The long dark shape of the A-12 lifting from the pale lake bed, the sound arriving late, as sound does when the source is already somewhere else, and the watchers on the ground, miles and miles away, squinting into a sky that offered them nothing but a fading silver thread and a silence that somehow felt louder than noise. They had seen something. They just didn't know what. There is a particular quality to a secret that has been kept for a very long time. It acquires weight. It acquires texture. It begins to feel, to the people who carry it, less like information withheld and more like a second skin. Something so integrated into the way they move through the world that they can no longer quite imagine existing without it. And to the people on the outside, the ones who sense that something is being withheld without knowing what, the secret acquires a different kind of weight entirely. It becomes a vessel, something to be filled. By the early 1960s, the vessel that was Area 51 was already being filled with remarkable speed. The UFO reports have been accumulating for years, fed by the U-2 and A-12 programs, without either program's knowledge becoming public. But there was another stream feeding the mythology now, one that flowed not from Nevada but from the New Mexico desert. and not from the 1960s, but from 15 years earlier. Because to tell the full story of what Area 51 came to mean in the American imagination, you have to go back to the summer of 1947 and to a ranch outside a small town called Roswell. The Roswell incident is, depending on your perspective, either the most significant event in human history or one of the most durable and creatively embellished misunderstandings of the modern era. What is not in dispute is the basic sequence of events. In late June or early July of 1947, something crashed on the ranch of a man named W.W. Brazel, roughly 75 miles north of Roswell, New Mexico. Brazel found the debris scattered over a wide area, described as metallic, unusual in its properties, and reported it to the local sheriff. The sheriff contacted Roswell Army Airfield. The Army sent personnel to collect the wreckage, and on July 8, 1947, the public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release stating that the Army had recovered a flying disc. The world, already primed by a summer of flying saucer sightings that had begun just weeks earlier with a widely reported incident over Mount Rainier in Washington state, responded with immediate and intense excitement. For approximately one day, it appeared that the United States military had confirmed the recovery of something extraordinary. Then, within 24 hours, the story changed. The wreckage, the Army now said, was nothing more than the remains of a weather balloon. A mundane explanation for a mundane incident. Move along. The about face was so abrupt, and the initial press release so specific in its language, that it planted a seed of suspicion that no subsequent explanation could fully uproot. And when, decades later, the true nature of the debris was finally revealed, it was the wreckage of Project Mogul, a classified program using high-altitude balloons to monitor Soviet nuclear tests, which was why the Army had been so quick to suppress the initial story. Many people found the truth, however plausible, arriving too late to displace the mythology that had grown in its absence. Roswell, it must be said clearly, has no direct connection to Area 51 in any documented, factual sense. The base in Nevada did not exist in 1947. It would not be established for another 8 years. But in the geography of the American imagination, the two became linked almost inevitably, because they occupied the same conceptual territory. Classified desert facilities, government secrecy, unexplained phenomena, the suggestion that what the public was being told and what was actually true were two entirely different things. Roswell fed Area 51's mythology not through any operational connection, but through cultural gravity. Two mysteries orbiting each other until, in the popular mind, they became inseparable. And into this already charged atmosphere, in the 1970s and 1980s, new elements began to arrive. The Freedom of Information Act, passed in 1966 and significantly strengthened in 1974, began to shake loose documents that the government would have preferred remain buried. Researchers and journalists filed requests and waited, and sometimes what came back, heavily redacted, in many cases, but present, confirmed that programs existed that the government had not acknowledged, that facilities existed that the government had not admitted to, that the reflexive official position of "we have nothing to hide" was, in at least some cases, precisely the opposite of the truth. This was not paranoia. This was evidence, and it did something important to the public relationship with government secrecy. It established, on a factual basis, that the instinct to question official denials was sometimes the correct instinct. The problem, of course, is that once that instinct is established and validated, it does not come with a built-in calibration. It does not tell you which denials to question and which to accept. It simply tells you that denial is not the same as truth, and it leaves you to sort out the rest on your own. Into this environment, in 1989, walked a man named Bob Lazar. What Lazar claimed was, by any measure, extraordinary. He said he had been recruited to work at a site adjacent to Area 51, a location he called S4, which he described as being built into the hillside near Papoose Lake, several miles south of Groom Lake. And at S4, he said he had worked as a physicist on the reverse engineering of extraterrestrial spacecraft. Not one spacecraft, 9 of them, recovered from various locations, stored in hangar bays disguised against the desert hillside, and quietly being studied by a team of scientists trying to understand propulsion systems that operated on principles no human physicist had independently derived. Lazar described the propulsion system in specific technical terms, an element he called Element 115, which he claimed was used to generate a gravity wave that allowed the craft to warp the space around it rather than moving through space in the conventional sense. He described the craft themselves in detail. He described the interior. He described the sensation of watching one of the craft perform a test flight. And he did all of this on television, in a series of interviews with a Las Vegas news reporter named George Knapp, under his own name, at considerable personal risk. The response was immediate and divided along lines that have never fully closed. To believers, Lazar was a whistleblower of extraordinary courage, a man with specific, technical, internally consistent testimony who had nothing obvious to gain and a great deal to lose by coming forward. To skeptics, he was something else entirely, a man whose educational credentials could not be verified, whose employment records at the facilities he claimed to have worked for did not appear to exist, and whose story, however compelling in its detail, rested entirely on his own uncorroborated account. The verification problem cut both ways, and this is worth sitting with for a moment. Lazar's supporters argued that the absence of records was itself evidence, that a program as classified as the one he described would naturally scrub the employment records of anyone who participated in it, leaving the very absence of documentation as a kind of negative proof. His skeptics argued that the absence of records was simply the absence of records, and that building an evidentiary case on what cannot be found is a logical structure with serious weaknesses. Both positions had a kind of internal coherence. Neither could be definitively resolved. What Lazar's interviews did, regardless of their ultimate truth or falsehood, was irreversible. They gave the Area 51 mythology a specific geography, a specific technology, and a specific narrative of government concealment that was far more elaborate and far more emotionally compelling than anything that had come before. Before Lazar, the question hanging over Area 51 was a vague one. Something strange is happening there. After Lazar, the question had an answer, at least for a significant portion of the population that found his account credible. And that answer involved recovered spacecraft, non-human technology, and a level of secrecy so deep that it operated outside the normal structures of government oversight entirely. Element 115, the substance Lazar described as the fuel source for the alien craft, is worth a particular note here. At the time of Lazar's interviews in 1989, Element 115 did not exist as a synthesized element. It was a gap in the periodic table, a theoretical position. In 2003, scientists in Russia and the United States successfully synthesized it for the first time. In 2016, it was formally added to the periodic table under the name Moscovium. It is a highly unstable element that decays within fractions of a second under laboratory conditions and bears no known resemblance to the stable, energy-producing substance Lazar described. But for many people, the simple fact that the element he named in 1989 turned out to exist was confirmation enough. a detail too specific, too technical, and too eventually accurate to be simply invented. The counter-argument. That element 115's existence as a theoretical position was known to physicists before Lazar described it, and that its eventual synthesis confirmed the periodic table's predictions rather than Lazar's claims, is accurate but tends to land with less force than the simpler narrative. This is not a failure of reason, so much as a feature of how human beings process information when they are already inclined toward a particular conclusion. We find what we are looking for, all of us, in different directions, about different things, with different degrees of awareness that we're doing it. And so, through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the mythology of Area 51 grew and grew. Books were written, documentaries were filmed. A quiet two-lane highway in Nevada, running past the edge of the restricted zone and marked at intervals by plain white signs warning that photography was prohibited and that deadly force was authorized, became a pilgrimage route. People drove out from Las Vegas in rental cars and stood at the boundary and looked toward the mountains and felt the particular charged feeling of standing at the edge of a secret. The installation itself, meanwhile, was doing what it had always done: working, building, testing, flying things that the rest of the world would not learn about for years or decades, or possibly ever. The gap between what was imagined to be happening inside the fence and what was actually happening inside the fence had never been wider. And in a way, that gap was its own kind of answer, not to the questions people were asking, but to the deeper question underneath them, which was simply this: what does it mean to be kept in the dark? There is a stretch of road in rural Nevada that appears, on most maps, to go nowhere in particular. It branches off US Highway 93 near the small town of Crystal Springs, winds through a landscape of sage and silence, and eventually arrives at a junction marked by a mailbox, a battered, weathered thing that became, over the years, one of the most photographed objects in the state of Nevada. The mailbox belonged to a rancher named Steve Medlin, who used it for the mundane purpose of receiving mail. But to the thousands of people who began making the drive out from Las Vegas in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it had become something else entirely. It had become a landmark, a waypoint, the closest thing to a front door that the most secret place in America had ever had. The road that runs past that mailbox is Nevada State Route 375. And in 1996, in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously tongue-in-cheek and entirely sincere, the state of Nevada officially renamed it the Extraterrestrial Highway. The naming was partly a tourism play. Nevada has always understood the commercial value of the strange, but it was also a recognition of something that had genuinely happened to this remote corner of the high desert. A community had grown up around the secret, not inside it, not privy to it, but alongside it, feeding on the energy that secrets generate when they are large enough and old enough and surrounded by enough silence. The town of Rachel, Nevada, population somewhere between 50 and 100, depending on the season and who was counting, found itself at the center of this community almost by accident. It had a bar and a diner and a single establishment that went by the name the Little Ale Inn, the apostrophe doing considerable work. And on any given weekend in the early 1990s, that establishment might be hosting UFO researchers from 3 different countries, documentary film crews, curious tourists from the suburbs of Los Angeles, and the occasional individual who had driven out alone in the night and was having what could only be described as a profound personal experience in the parking lot. It was, by all accounts, a remarkable thing to witness. And it was happening because of a convergence that no one had planned and no one could entirely control. Bob Lazar's interviews had opened a door. The Freedom of Information Act releases had confirmed that secrets existed, and a new technology was arriving that would change the nature of information itself in ways that no government classification system had been designed to handle. The internet, in its early and ungainly form, was beginning to connect people who had previously been isolated in their curiosity. Researchers who had spent years working alone, witnesses who had never found anyone willing to take their accounts seriously, enthusiasts who had been quietly collecting documents and photographs and testimony for decades without any way to share what they had gathered. Now they could find each other. Now they could build, collectively, a body of material that no single person could have assembled alone. The Area 51 online community of the early 1990s was, in retrospect, a prototype of something that would become very familiar in the decades that followed. A distributed network of amateur investigators, some rigorous and some credulous, some motivated by genuine curiosity and some by something harder to define, collectively constructing a parallel history of a place and a program that the official record refused to acknowledge. The quality of the work varied enormously. Some of it was careful and sourced and intellectually honest about what could and could not be established from available evidence. Some of it was not. The internet, then as now, made no distinction between the two, and the mythology grew in both directions simultaneously, more detailed and more elaborate, and, in places, more untethered from the foundation of verifiable fact with every passing month. Into this atmosphere, in 1993, arrived a moment that crystallized everything. A filmmaker and journalist named Tom Mahood, along with other researchers, had been using publicly available aerial photographs and careful geographical analysis to locate the precise position of facilities within the restricted zone that the government had never officially described. Their work attracted attention, and the attention attracted something else, a lawsuit filed in 1994 on behalf of current and former workers at the base that would pierce the veil of secrecy around Area 51 in a way that no journalist or Freedom of Information request had managed to do. The lawsuit concerned something that had nothing to do with spacecraft or extraterrestrial technology. It concerned something considerably more earthly and considerably more toxic. The workers who brought the suit, some of them gravely ill, some of them already dead by the time the case proceeded, alleged that they had been exposed to hazardous chemical waste during their time at the facility. Classified materials, they said, had been burned in open pits on the base. The smoke from those pits had carried compounds whose names read like a chemistry textbook: trichloroethylene, dioxins, dibenzofurans, into the air that the workers breathed day after day. Several had developed serious illnesses. Some had died, and when they or their families had sought medical treatment, the doctors had been unable to get access to the classified information about what the patients had been exposed to because the government would not confirm the base existed, let alone disclose what chemicals had been burned there. The case was a genuine human tragedy, and it deserves to be remembered as such rather than simply as a footnote in the larger story of the base's secrecy. These were working people, mechanics, technicians, laborers, who had served their country's classified programs faithfully and had been, in return, exposed to serious health risks without their informed knowledge or consent. The government's response to their lawsuit was to invoke the state's secrets privilege, a legal doctrine allowing the executive branch to withhold information from court proceedings on national security grounds. President Clinton signed a presidential determination each year exempting the facility from environmental disclosure laws that would have applied to any other location in the country. The lawsuit ultimately failed to achieve its central goal of compelling disclosure about the specific materials involved, but it achieved something else. It forced the government, for the first time in a public legal proceeding, to implicitly acknowledge that the facility existed and that it was subject to the direct oversight of the President of the United States. The base was real. It was acknowledged, obliquely, in the language of legal filings and presidential determinations. The door that had been sealed for 40 years had not been opened, but someone had finally confirmed, in writing, that there was a door. The popular culture response to all of this was exactly what you would expect, and it arrived with the timing that only the 1990s could have produced. In 1994, a television series premiered that would go on a run for 9 seasons and become one of the defining cultural artifacts of its decade. The X-Files took the entire architecture of Area 51 mythology, the government cover-up, the recovered technology, the shadowy figures who knew the truth and would do anything to suppress it, and wove it into a serialized narrative of extraordinary craft and ambition. Mulder and Scully became, for an entire generation, the faces of a particular kind of epistemological position. The belief that official explanations were insufficient, that the truth existed but was being actively concealed, and that the pursuit of that truth was both necessary and dangerous. The show's creator, Chris Carter, was careful to situate the mythology in recognizable real-world geography and history. Area 51 appeared explicitly and repeatedly. The Roswell incident was incorporated and expanded. Classified government programs were depicted with enough verisimilitude to feel plausible without crossing into anything that could be legally challenged. And the tagline that became the show's signature, "The truth is out there," captured something that a significant portion of the American public genuinely believed about the relationship between official narratives and reality. It was not simply a slogan. It was a diagnosis of a particular cultural mood, and the mood was real, and Area 51 was at the center of it. By the mid-1990s, the base was receiving a level of public attention that its founders could not have imagined, and its current operators very much did not want. Journalists were camped on hilltops with telephoto lenses pointed toward the valley. Researchers were filing Freedom of Information requests by the hundreds. Former workers, some of them ailing and some of them simply old and tired of carrying the weight of decades of secrecy, were beginning to talk, carefully, elliptically, in ways that confirmed the reality of classified aircraft programs without providing specific technical details, but confirming it nonetheless. And then, in the summer of 1996, something happened that no one had anticipated, and that the Air Force handled with a combination of reluctant pragmatism and careful damage control. Satellite imagery of the Groom Lake facility, detailed, clear, commercially available satellite imagery, appeared on the internet. It had been captured by a Russian commercial satellite and made available through a private company. The images showed the base in considerable detail: the runways, the hangars, the support facilities, the roads. Everything that the government had spent 40 years insisting did not exist was now visible to anyone with a computer and an internet connection. The official response was, in hindsight, almost poignant in its futility. The Air Force quietly purchased the land around the facility, additional buffer zones extending the restricted perimeter further into the surrounding desert, pushing the hilltops from which photographers have been capturing images of the base into the restricted zone itself. The photographers moved further back. The perimeter moved further out. It was a slow, expensive, and ultimately symbolic chase. An institution trying to reassert control over information in an age when information had learned to move faster than institutions could follow. The secret was not exactly out, but it was no longer exactly in either. And that unstable middle ground, not confirmed, not deniable, not resolvable by any available authority, was precisely where Area 51 would live for the next several years, generating heat and light in the culture far out of proportion to anything that could be said about it with confidence. The desert, as always, said nothing. The mountains kept their own counsel. And somewhere behind the warning signs and the motion sensors and the camouflage-painted trucks that patrol the perimeter, the work continued. As it always had, as it always would. There is a particular kind of moment in the life of a long-kept secret when the people responsible for keeping it begin to sense, with a quiet and growing certainty, that the effort required to maintain it has begun to exceed the value of maintaining it. It is not a dramatic moment. There is no single conversation, no single decision, no clean line between before and after. It is more like the way a tide turns, gradually, almost imperceptibly, and then all at once when you look back at where the waterline used to be. By the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, the people responsible for the secrets of Groom Lake were approaching something like that tide turn. Not with respect to everything. There were programs underway at the facility that remained as sensitive as anything that had ever been housed there, and the culture of absolute compartmentalization that had governed the base since Kelly Johnson's first survey flight in 1955 had not changed in any fundamental way. But with respect to the history, the programs that had ended, the aircraft that had been retired, the Cold War missions that now belonged to a world that no longer existed, the calculus was shifting. The shift had been nudged along by the workers' lawsuit of the mid-1990s, which had forced a kind of oblique acknowledgement of the base's existence into the public legal record. It had been nudged further by the satellite imagery that had made the physical reality of Groom Lake visible to anyone with an internet connection. And it was being nudged continuously by the passage of time itself, because the engineers and pilots and mechanics who had built and flown and maintained the U-2 and the A-12 were aging, and some of them were dying, and they were carrying with them stories that the historical record had no way to capture as long as those stories remained classified. There was also, underneath all of this, a more pragmatic consideration. The mythology that had grown up around Area 51, the alien spacecraft, the reverse-engineered propulsion systems, the subterranean levels and the bodies in the freezers, had reached a scale and a cultural penetration that was, from the government's perspective, genuinely problematic in a way that simple secrecy no longer solved. Because the mythology was not going away, it was, if anything, growing. And as long as the government maintained a posture of total denial about everything connected to the facility, it had no way to say here is what was actually there without simultaneously confirming that it had spent decades lying about the base's existence. The choice between two uncomfortable positions, continued total denial, or partial disclosure that invited questions about what remained undisclosed, had no clean resolution. What emerged over the course of the late 1990s and into the 2000s was something in between. A gradual, managed, carefully limited opening of the historical record. Not a confession, not a press conference, but a series of small steps. Declassified documents appearing through FOIA requests. Official histories quietly published by agencies that had previously denied any connection to the programs in question, and most visibly, a growing willingness on the part of former participants to speak publicly about what they had done. The U-2 program had already been partially declassified by this point. The power shootdown had made total secrecy impossible back in 1960, and over the subsequent decades the broad outlines of the program had become part of the public record. But the A-12 and the Oxcar program were different. They had remained almost entirely in the dark, overshadowed in the public imagination by the more famous state Route 71 Blackbird that had followed them, and protected by the institutional instinct towards secrecy that had outlasted the Cold War itself. The pilots who had flown the A-12 had spent decades unable to answer the question that follows every veteran. What did you do in the service? With anything approaching the truth? Some of them had watched the state Route 71 receive parades and museum displays and the admiring attention of an aviation-literate public, while their own more dangerous, more pioneering work remained invisible. In 2007, the CIA took a step that was, for that institution, remarkable. It hosted a formal gathering at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, to which surviving 12 pilots and program veterans were invited. The event was not entirely public. It was not a press conference, but it was photographed, documented, and its existence was acknowledged. The men who had spent their careers flying in absolute secrecy were brought into a room and told, in effect, that their country knew what they had done and was grateful for it. Several of them wept. They had waited, in some cases, for 40 years for that acknowledgement. The broader declassification of the Oxcart program that followed over the next several years released documents that filled in the history in remarkable detail. Mission logs, technical specifications, photographs of the aircraft that had never been cleared for public release, personal accounts from pilots and engineers that had been collected by CIA historians and held in classified archives for decades. The picture that emerged was one of extraordinary human achievement accomplished under conditions of profound isolation and considerable personal sacrifice, and it bore almost no resemblance to the mythology that had grown up around the facility in the same period. There were no alien spacecraft in the documents. There were no underground levels housing recovered technology. There was instead something that was in its own way more remarkable. The story of human ingenuity pushed to its absolute limit, again and again, in the service of a national security mission that its participants understood with clarity and believed in with conviction. But disclosure, even careful and managed disclosure, has a way of opening questions it was not intended to open. Because once the government confirmed, through the release of these documents, that it had operated a classified facility at Groom Lake for decades and had conducted programs of extraordinary sensitivity there, the natural question, what is happening there now, became both more pressing and more legitimate. The acknowledgement of past secrecy is, in a sense, an implicit confirmation that present secrecy is possible. If they hid this for 40 years, what are they hiding now? It is a question without a publicly available answer, and it is worth spending a moment with the architecture of that unavailability. The United States government's classification system is not, in its design, intended to deceive the public. It is intended to protect information whose disclosure would cause specific, identifiable harm to national security. That is a legitimate function. The problem, and it is a real problem, acknowledged by classification experts across the political spectrum, is that the system has no reliable mechanism for distinguishing between information that genuinely requires protection and information that is classified because classification is the institutional default, or because disclosure would be embarrassing rather than genuinely dangerous, or because the people responsible for making the determination are the same people whose programs would be scrutinized if the determination went the other way. The National Security Archive, a nonprofit research organization at George Washington University that has spent decades filing FOIA requests and publishing the results, has documented case after case of information that was classified at the highest levels and maintained in that classification for years or decades before being released, only for the released documents to reveal that the original basis for classification was weak, outdated, or in some cases essentially non-existent. This is not a partisan observation. It is a structural one. Classification systems, like all bureaucratic systems, tend towards self-perpetuation, and the culture of secrecy that had built Groom Lake and sustained it through the Cold War did not simply evaporate when the Cold War ended. What had changed, slowly and incompletely, was the public posture. In 2013, a year that will be discussed in more detail in a later segment of this story, the CIA released a document that for the first time officially acknowledged the existence of the facility at Groom Lake by name, in response to a FOIA request filed by researchers of the National Security Archive. The document, A History of the U-2 program, referred to the base directly and included geographical coordinates. It was a bureaucratic act, almost casual in its presentation. But for the researchers who had spent years or decades working toward that acknowledgement, it landed with the weight of something much larger. Because language matters, official language, in particular, carries a kind of weight that no amount of satellite imagery or leaked documents or whistleblower testimony can quite replicate. When a government says, in an official document, that a thing exists, it is doing something categorically different from simply failing to deny it. It is placing the thing inside the circle of acknowledged reality, the shared factual world that institutions and citizens and historians and courts navigate together. Area 51, after 60 years, had crossed that threshold. It had done so quietly, in a released document, without press conference or ceremony. But the people who had been waiting for it noticed. They always do. And yet, even as this partial acknowledgement was settling into the historical record, the facility itself was doing something that partial acknowledgement does nothing to address. It was changing, growing, expanding in ways that the commercial satellite imagery of the 2000s and 2010s was capturing with increasing clarity and resolution. New construction, new runways, new buildings whose purpose was as opaque to outside observers as everything at Groom Lake had always been. The base that had been built to test the U-2 had become, over 6 decades, something considerably larger and more complex than its founders had imagined. And whatever it was being used for now was operating under the same cloak of classification that had covered everything that came before. The curtain had moved. Light had come through, in thin and carefully managed beams. But the curtain had not been drawn back. Not fully. Perhaps not ever. The desert, patient as it has always been, waited. The mountains held their silence. And the work, whatever the work now was, continued behind the wire, in the tradition of everything that had come before it, unseen and unacknowledged, as American as apple pie and as secret as the recipe. There is a quality to darkness that engineers understand differently from the rest of us. Where most people experience darkness as an absence, the absence of light, of visibility, of the reassuring ability to see what surrounds you. Engineers who work on stealth technology experience it as a design goal. A specification, something to be achieved through calculation and material science and geometric precision, measured not in lumens, but in radar cross-sections, in the square centimeters of reflective surface that an aircraft presents to an incoming electromagnetic wave. To make something dark in this sense, invisible not to the eye but to the instruments that see in frequencies the eye cannot, is one of the most demanding engineering problems the 20th century produced, and it was solved in large part in the Nevada desert at the facility that the world was only just beginning to acknowledge existed. To tell this part of the story properly, we need to step back a few decades and pick up a thread that has been running quietly alongside everything else we have discussed. Because stealth technology did not arrive suddenly in the 1980s with the dramatic public unveiling of the F-117. It had a long and largely invisible history, which is, when you think about it, entirely appropriate, that stretched back to the earliest days of Groom Lake and was woven into the culture of innovation that the base had cultivated from its very beginning. The theoretical foundations of what would become stealth were laid, in part, by a Soviet physicist named Pyotr Yefimtsev who published a paper in 1964 on the mathematical relationship between an object's shape and its radar signature. The paper was considered so theoretical, so remote from any practical application, that Soviet authorities allowed it to be published openly, apparently concluding that no one would be able to use it for anything. They were wrong. A Lockheed mathematician named Dennis Overholser encountered the paper in the early 1970s and recognized, with the particular excitement of someone who has just found the piece that completes a puzzle they have been working on for years, that Ufimtsev's equations provided a roadmap for designing an aircraft that would be almost invisible to radar. What Ufimtsev had shown, in the dense mathematical language of electromagnetic theory, was that an aircraft's radar cross-section, the measure of how detectable it is to radar, is determined primarily by the shape of its surfaces rather than its size. A large aircraft with the right geometric configuration could be far less detectable than a small aircraft with the wrong one. The key was to design surfaces that reflected incoming radar energy away from its source rather than back toward it. To make the aircraft, in effect, a collection of angled mirrors that deflected the light rather than reflecting it back into the eyes of the observer. The aircraft that emerged from the application of these principles was the HAV Blue demonstrator, built and tested at Groom Lake in the late 1970s. HAV Blue was, by conventional aesthetic standards, deeply strange looking. It had flat, angular surfaces that met at sharp angles, giving it a faceted appearance unlike anything that had flown before. Less like a conventional aircraft, and more like a geometric abstraction, a three-dimensional shape that seemed to belong in a mathematics classroom rather than the sky. It was not aerodynamically stable in any natural sense. Conventional physics would have preferred it to tumble. It was kept in controlled flight entirely by a computerized fly-by-wire system that made thousands of tiny adjustments per second to keep the aircraft pointed in the right direction. Flying it, the test pilot said, was like trying to control something that actively wanted to fall out of the sky, held in line only by the insistence of the computers. But when the HAV Blue demonstrators were tested against radar systems, the results were extraordinary. An aircraft that should have been clearly visible to any defensive radar network was, in practical terms, nearly invisible. The radar cross-section was reduced to something comparable to a small bird, in some configurations, to something considerably smaller. The technology worked, and the implications for military aviation were profound in ways that the engineers at Groom Lake understood immediately and completely, even as the broader defense establishment was still coming to terms with what had been achieved. HAV Blue led directly to the F-117 Nighthawk, which was developed at Groom Lake through the late 1970s and into the 1980s under a program called Senior Trend. The F-117, despite its fighter designation, was not actually a fighter aircraft in any conventional sense. It carried no air-to-air missiles, had no radar of its own, and was not designed for air combat. It was a precision strike aircraft, designed to penetrate heavily defended airspace undetected, deliver munitions with extraordinary accuracy, and depart before defensive systems could locate and engage it. It was, in a sense, the logical descendant of the U-2 and the A-12, another aircraft built around the principle that the best protection is not to be seen at all. The F-117 was operational by 1983, flying missions out of bases in Nevada, while the Air Force officially maintained that it did not exist. This required a particular kind of operational discipline that the pilots and ground crews who flew and maintained the aircraft sustained with remarkable consistency for nearly 5 years. The aircraft flew only at night. It was kept in closed hangars during daylight hours. Personnel assigned to the program lived under the same restrictions that had governed life at Groom Lake since the U-2 days. limited communication with family, cover stories for employment, the weight of a secret that could not be shared. When the F-117 was finally revealed to the public in November 1988, the Air Force released a single photograph, a carefully composed image that showed the aircraft's profile without revealing all of its angles and features, preserving some classified aspects of the design even in the act of disclosure. The public response was immediate and genuinely astonished. Here was an aircraft that looked like nothing anyone had imagined, designed on principles that most people had never heard of, performing capabilities that seemed to belong to science fiction rather than operational military hardware. It had been flying in secret for 5 years. The Gulf War of 1991 brought the F-117 to the world's full attention. In the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm, F-117s flew into the most heavily defended airspace in the Middle East and struck targets in Baghdad with a precision and impunity that announced, definitively, that stealth technology had changed the fundamental calculus of air warfare. The aircraft that the Iraqi Air Defense Network could not detect, could not engage, and could not stop was not a prototype or an experiment. It was a production aircraft, built in quantity, flown by trained crews, delivering real munitions to real targets with real effect. The age of stealth had arrived, and it had arrived fully formed because it had been quietly developing for 15 years in the Nevada desert. But the F-117, remarkable as it was, represented only one direction in which stealth technology was developing at Groom Lake. There was another program running in parallel, more ambitious, more expensive, and in some ways more technically extraordinary, that would produce an aircraft even more visually striking and even more capable than the Angular Nighthawk. That program was developing what would become the B-2 Spirit bomber, and while much of its development took place at other facilities, the testing and refinement that validated its stealth characteristics drew heavily on the infrastructure and expertise that had been built up at Groom Lake over the preceding decades. The B-2's flying wing design, a smooth, blended shape that seemed to contradict everything the Angular F-117 had established about stealth geometry, represented the next generation of thinking about radar signature reduction. Where the F-117 used flat facets to deflect radar energy in specific directions, the B-2 used carefully curved surfaces and advanced radar-absorbing materials to achieve a similar effect with a design that was aerodynamically far more efficient. T could carry a larger payload further, with greater efficiency, while maintaining a radar cross-section that was, by some accounts, comparable to a large insect. The two aircraft, side by side, looked like they belonged to entirely different philosophies. In a sense they did, but they were branches of the same tree, rooted in the same desert soil. The stealth programs illustrate something important about Groom Lake that gets lost in the more colorful narratives of alien spacecraft and government cover-ups. The genuine achievements of the facility, the things that were actually happening behind the wire, the reasons the security was as absolute as it was, were not mundane. They were not boring. They did not require the addition of extraterrestrial technology to be extraordinary. They were, on their own terms, among the most significant advances in military aviation of the 20th century, produced by human beings working at the edge of what was known and possible, accepting significant personal risk, sustained by a culture of secrecy that was the precondition of their success. The irony is precise and somewhat melancholy. The real story of Area 51, the documented, declassified, historically verifiable real story, is a story of astonishing human achievement. It is a story that deserves to be told and celebrated and understood. but it spent so long in the dark that by the time it began to emerge into the light, the space it should have occupied in the public imagination had already been filled by something else. Something louder and stranger and more resistant to the mundane satisfactions of factual explanation. The engineers who built the Have Blue demonstrator in the 1970s could not have known that their work would one day share cultural real estate with stories of recovered alien spacecraft. They were solving differential equations and wind tunnel problems and material science challenges. They were doing, in other words, what human beings do when they are at their most remarkable, pushing the boundaries of what is possible through the application of intelligence and discipline and accumulated knowledge, in service of a mission they believed in a place that the rest of the world did not know existed. That place has a name. It has always had a name. And the name, simple and numerical and entirely without drama, somehow contains all of this. The achievement and the secrecy and the mythology and the irony and the long, patient silence of the desert that holds it all. Area 51. There is something quietly remarkable about the moment when a government decides to tell the truth about something it has been lying about for a very long time. Not the dramatic, forced confession, the kind that comes at the barrel of a congressional subpoena or the sharp end of a journalistic investigation that has already published its findings and is simply waiting for a response. But the quieter kind, the kind that arrives in the form of a released document, slipped into the public record on an otherwise unremarkable day, carrying within its bureaucratic language the weight of 60 years of denial finally, partially, officially withdrawn. That moment came on June 25th, 2013, and like so many of the most significant moments in the history of Area 51, it arrived without ceremony. The document in question was a history of the U-2 program, prepared by CIA historians and running to several hundred pages, released in response to a Freedom of Information Act request filed by researchers at the National Security Archive at George Washington University. It was not the first time CIA documents had been released through this channel. The National Security Archive had been filing requests and litigating for access to classified records for decades, and over those decades had extracted from the government a remarkable volume of material that would otherwise have remained permanently buried. But this particular release was different, because embedded within the careful historical prose of the U-2 program history, almost as though the authors were testing how lightly they could place it before the world, was a sentence that had never appeared in any official government document before. The document referred to the facility at Groom Lake by name. It described its location. It acknowledged its role in the development of the U-2. And in doing so, it completed, or rather, began the completion of a 60-year arc from the spring afternoon in 1955 when Kelly Johnson first looked down from a small aircraft at the pale surface of that dry lake bed and said this was the most perfect location he could have imagined, to the summer morning in 2013 when a government historian's careful prose placed the same location, officially and irrevocably, inside the circle of acknowledged reality. The response from researchers and journalists and the broader public was a mixture of satisfaction and bemusement. Satisfaction because the acknowledgement was real and meaningful and had been a long time coming, and bemusement because the thing being acknowledged was something that virtually everyone had already known for years. The base had been photographed from orbit. Its runways had been measured by amateur researchers with publicly available mapping software. Former workers had described it in books and interviews. The government had acknowledged its existence implicitly in presidential determinations and legal filings going back 2 decades. The 2013 release was, in the strictest sense, the official acknowledgement of something that was not, by that point, a secret to anyone. And yet it mattered. It mattered because of what official acknowledgement does that unofficial knowledge cannot. It closes a particular kind of argument. It removes a specific category of dismissal. The dismissal that says you cannot trust sources that the government has not confirmed, that the absence of official acknowledgement is itself a form of evidence, that the researchers and witnesses and whistleblowers who had been saying for decades that the base existed were operating outside the bounds of verifiable reality. After June 25, 2013, that dismissal was no longer available. The base was real. It had always been real. The government now said so. What the government did not say, what the 2013 release was carefully constructed not to address, was the broader question that the acknowledgement inevitably raised. If the facility existed, and if it had been used for classified programs of the kind described in the release documents, what else had it been used for? The document covered the U-2 program through the early 1970s. It touched on the broader context of Cold War aerial reconnaissance, but it did not address the decades that followed. It did not address what was happening at the facility at the moment of its release. It drew a circle around a specific historical period and said, here is what we will tell you about this. And the implication of the circle's boundary was clear. Outside this boundary, the previous rules still apply. This is the nature of managed disclosure, and it is worth understanding as a phenomenon in its own right. Governments do not release classified information because they have concluded that secrecy is no longer appropriate in general. They release specific information about specific programs when the calculus of a specific situation, the age of the material, the public interest pressure, the legal requirements, the assessment of current sensitivity, tips far enough in the direction of release. Each release is a decision about that particular material. It carries no implication about anything else. The architecture of secrecy that surrounds the unreleased material remains intact, and the release itself can actually strengthen that architecture by demonstrating that the government is capable of disclosure when disclosure is appropriate, implying that the things it continues to withhold are being withheld for legitimate reasons. Understanding this does not require cynicism. It requires clarity about how institutions function and what their incentives are. The people who made the decision to release the U-2 history in 2013 were not, in all likelihood, engaged in a sophisticated strategic deception. They were making a bureaucratic determination about a body of historical material that had reached the point where its continued classification was difficult to justify, and its release served the legitimate historical record. The fact that the release was carefully bounded, that it revealed what it revealed and concealed what it concealed, was not necessarily the product of malice. It was the product of a system designed to release as little as possible while satisfying the legal and political pressure to release something. In the years following the 2013 acknowledgement, the trickle of official information about Groom Lake continued. Additional documents were released through FOIA requests. Former program participants, emboldened by the official acknowledgement of the facility's existence, spoke more freely about their experiences. The CIA's Center for the Study of Intelligence published material on the Oxcar program, and the A-12 that filled in details the earlier releases had left vague. Slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, the historical record of what had happened at Groom Lake from the mid-1950s through the Cold War's end was being assembled from fragments, some official, some personal, some technical, some anecdotal, into something approaching a coherent narrative. That narrative, for all its gaps, is genuinely extraordinary. The U-2, which flew operational reconnaissance missions from 1956 until well into the 2000s, the same basic airframe, continuously upgraded, still flying weather research and other missions to this day. The A-12, which flew faster and higher than anything before or since in operational service. The F-117, which changed the nature of air warfare in a single night over Baghdad. The stealth programs that followed, whose full extent remains classified. The drone programs that began at Groom Lake in the 1990s and have become, in the decades since, one of the defining technologies of modern warfare. Each of these represents a chapter in a story of technological achievement that is, by any reasonable measure, among the most significant in the history of aviation. And yet, sitting alongside this genuine history, the mythology persisted. It persisted not because the people who held it were incapable of updating their beliefs in response to new information, but because the new information, however significant, did not address the specific claims of the mythology had been built around. The 2013 acknowledgement confirmed the base existed. It said nothing about alien spacecraft. The Oxcart declassification described the A-12 in exhaustive technical detail. It said nothing about Bob Lazar or S-4 or Element 115. The official record, in filling in the true history, was filling in a different shape from the one the mythology occupied. The two could coexist, and they did, and they do. Bob Lazar himself remained a persistent and somewhat paradoxical presence in this landscape. In the years and decades since his original 1989 interviews, he had neither recanted nor significantly elaborated his claims. He had maintained, with a consistency that his supporters found compelling and his critics found suspicious, the same basic account he had given from the beginning. In 2019, a documentary about his life and claims was released, directed by Jeremy Corbell, and it brought his story to a new generation of viewers who encountered it without the specific cultural context of the late 1980s, but with the same fundamental inability to verify or definitively refute what he described. The documentary arrived at a moment when the broader question of unidentified aerial phenomena, the term that had by then largely replaced UFO in official and semi-official discourse, chosen partly because it carried less cultural baggage and partly because it was more technically accurate, was undergoing its own remarkable transition. For the first time in decades, the question was being treated seriously by mainstream institutions. The Pentagon had established and then revealed the existence of a program dedicated to investigating such phenomena. Former military pilots were giving credible, detailed accounts of encounters with objects that behaved in ways that challenged their understanding of what was physically possible. The New York Times was publishing front-page stories on the subject. The conversation had shifted in ways that would have seemed implausible just a few years earlier. Whether any of this had anything to do with Area 51, specifically, was a question without a clear answer. The UAP phenomena being described by military pilots were being observed in various locations, not specifically over Nevada. The government programs investigating them were housed in different parts of the defense and intelligence establishment. The connection to Groom Lake, if any existed, remained as opaque as everything else about the facility's current operations. But the cultural connection, the thread running from the first UFO reports over Nevada in the 1950s through Roswell and Bob Lazar and the X-Files and the extraterrestrial highway to the Pentagon's UAP disclosures of the late 2010s, that thread was real, and it ran straight through the middle of the acknowledged, officially real, coordinates on a map facility at Groom Lake, Nevada. The mythology and the reality had become so intertwined over so many decades that separating them was no longer simply a matter of releasing the right documents. The truth was out there, some of it, anyway. The rest was still waiting, in the patient, timeless way that the desert waits for everything. There is a technology that has become so familiar, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that it is easy to forget how recently it arrived and how completely it has changed the relationship between secrets and the people who keep them. It fits in a pocket. It connects wirelessly and instantly to a global network of satellites. It can photograph with reasonable clarity almost anything within its line of sight. And it is carried at this moment by several billion human beings who think of it primarily as a way to check their messages and navigate to unfamiliar restaurants. The smartphone has done something to the culture of secrecy that no journalist, no freedom of information request, and no whistleblower has quite managed to do. It has made the keeping of large physical secrets that involve buildings and runways and aircraft and the movement of people and vehicles, genuinely, structurally difficult in a way that it simply was not before. Because the smartphones are everywhere, and the satellites they connect to are overhead, and the images those satellites produce are available to anyone willing to pay a modest subscription fee to a commercial imagery provider. The age in which a government could maintain a facility of significant size in a remote location and simply deny its existence has passed. Not because governments have become more honest, but because the tools available to verify or refute their denials have become too powerful and too widely distributed to be neutralized by classification alone. This is the world in which Area 51 now operates. And understanding what that means requires understanding what the facility has become, insofar as that can be understood from the outside, which is to say imperfectly, partially, and always with the caveat that what can be observed from commercial satellite is not the same as what is actually happening on the ground. What the satellites show, in the imagery that has been accumulating and improving since the first commercially available pictures appeared in the mid-1990s, is a facility that has grown substantially from its Cold War origins. The original Groom Lake installation that Kelly Johnson surveyed in 1955, a handful of hangars, a modest runway, minimal support facilities, has expanded into a complex of considerable scale. The runway that was extended to accommodate the A-12 has been extended further still. New hangars of significant size have appeared, some of them large enough to house aircraft whose dimensions exceed anything in the publicly acknowledged inventory of the United States Air Force. Support facilities, residential areas, and what appear to be administrative buildings have spread across the valley floor in ways that suggest a population considerably larger than the handful of engineers and pilots who first flew out from McCarran Airport on the unmarked Janet flights. The expansion is not subtle. It is visible to anyone who looks. And the people who look, the community of open-source intelligence researchers, aviation enthusiasts, and professional analysts who have been cataloging changes at the facility through commercial imagery for the past 2 decades, have documented it with considerable thoroughness. New construction appears. Old buildings are modified or demolished and replaced. The layout of the facility shifts in ways that suggest evolving operational requirements. Something is being done there. Several somethings, most likely. What those somethings are remains, as it has always remained, behind the wire and out of reach. The Janet flights continue. The white aircraft with the distinctive red stripe along the fuselage still depart from the special terminal at what is now Harry Reid International Airport in Las Vegas. The terminal that has no public signage, no posted schedules, and no acknowledgement of its own existence in any official airport documentation available to the general public. The aircraft land at Groom Lake on schedules that the open-source tracking community has documented with some precision, using flight tracking data and visual observation. The people who board those flights at the Las Vegas end and disembark at the Groom Lake end are doing so, as they always have, quietly, without public record, carrying whatever clearances the current programs require. The security perimeter remains absolute. The signs at the boundary of the restricted zone still carry their warning about deadly force. The camouflage-painted trucks that have patrolled the perimeter for decades still appear on the ridgelines when visitors approach the boundary, as they appear in countless photographs taken by tourists and researchers who drive out from Las Vegas on weekends. The guards, formerly employed by a private security contractor rather than directly by the military or any government agency, a structural choice that provides an additional layer of legal and operational insulation, maintain a vigilance that has not noticeably relaxed in response to any of the partial disclosures of the past 3 decades. What is being protected now, specifically, is a question that even the most diligent open-source researchers can only partially address. There are, broadly speaking, 2 categories of answer, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is conventional. The United States maintains, at any given moment, multiple classified aviation programs at various stages of development. New aircraft, new drone systems, new sensor packages, new propulsion concepts, and the testing and development of these programs requires the kind of controlled, remote, heavily secured environment that Groom Lake has provided for 70 years. The history of the facility is a history of classified aviation development, and there is no particular reason to believe that history has ended simply because some of its earlier chapters have been declassified. The programs that are currently being developed there are, by definition, the things we do not yet know about. They are the future equivalents of the U-2, the A-12, the Have Blue demonstrator, technologies that will eventually become public knowledge, or will remain classified indefinitely, but that are in either case real and explicable and rooted in the same tradition of pushing the boundaries of what is aeronautically possible that has defined the facility since its inception. There is evidence in the open source record for programs consistent with this conventional explanation. Aviation researchers have documented aircraft observed near the Groom Lake airspace that do not match any publicly acknowledged type. Unusual shapes, unusual flight characteristics, behavior suggesting advanced propulsion or control systems. Some of these observations are consistent with known developmental programs that have since been partially revealed. Others remain unattributed. The pattern is familiar. Unexplained observations accumulate. Explanations remain classified. The gap between what is seen and what is officially acknowledged generates speculation that eventually resolves, years or decades later, into the mundane revelation that what was seen was a classified aircraft program that has since entered service or been canceled or been superseded by something newer and more classified still. The second category of answer is the one that the mythology insists upon, and that the official record neither confirms nor adequately addresses. That something else is happening at Groom Lake. Something that does not fit within the conventional framework of classified military aviation development. Something that would require a fundamentally different kind of explanation. The proponents of this view point to the gap between what the facility's scale and security suggests about the sensitivity of its programs and what the conventional explanation can fully account for. They point to the testimony of individuals like Bob Lazar, whose account has never been officially refuted, only officially ignored, which is a different thing. They point to the broader context of the UAP disclosures that began in 2017, which confirmed that the United States government has been collecting and analyzing data on aerial phenomena that its own personnel cannot explain, and suggest that whatever is at the root of those phenomena may be connected to whatever is behind the wire at Groom Lake. These 2 categories of answer have coexisted for decades without resolution, and they will likely continue to coexist for decades more because the mechanism that would resolve them, full and unrestricted disclosure of everything that has occurred and is occurring at the facility, is not available and shows no sign of becoming available. The partial disclosures of the past 30 years have illuminated the historical record in important ways. They have not, and were not designed to, answer the questions that the mythology asks. In September of 2019, something happened that illustrated, with a clarity that was almost comic in its precision, exactly where the culture had arrived in its relationship with Area 51. A Facebook event, created as a joke by a college student, proposed that people gather in large numbers and storm the base. They can't stop all of us, being the organizing logic, to find out what was inside. The event was called Storm Area 51. They can't stop all of us. It was posted in the same casual, ironic register in which a great deal of internet content is created, not intended as a serious proposal, so much as a piece of shared cultural humor that drew on the mythology everyone already knew. Within weeks, 2 million people had marked themselves as attending. The Air Force issued a statement reminding the public that Groom Lake was a United States Air Force installation and that trespassing was inadvisable. The statement managed to be simultaneously a legal warning, an implicit acknowledgement of the base's existence, and a straight-faced engagement with an event that had started as a meme. It was, in its way, a perfect document of the moment. An institution that had spent 60 years denying the existence of a facility, now issuing formal warnings about approaching it. The event itself, in the end, drew a few thousand people to the desert outside Rachel, Nevada, far short of the 2 million who had clicked attending, as internet events reliably are. There were no breaches of the perimeter. There were food trucks and music, and a gathering of people who had come from remarkable distances to stand at the edge of secret and feel, if nothing else, the particular charged atmosphere that the place has generated for 70 years. The base, behind its wire and its mountains and its decades of accumulated mystery, remained exactly as inaccessible as it had always been. But something about the Storm Area 51 phenomenon illuminated the depth and the durability of the facility's hold on the public imagination in a way that no amount of academic analysis quite captures. 2 million people, a figure larger than the population of many nations, raised their hands to say they wanted to know what was inside, not because they had specific intelligence or credible sources, simply because the secret had been there for so long and had accumulated so much cultural weight and represented so completely the broader experience of being kept in the dark by institutions that held power over information, that the desire to push through the door and see for oneself had reached something like a cultural pressure point. That desire is not going anywhere. The base is not going anywhere. And whatever is happening behind the wire, conventional or otherwise, mundane or extraordinary, rooted in human ingenuity or in something that human ingenuity has not yet named, is not, in any foreseeable future, going to be laid out in full for public examination. The desert keeps its secrets. It always has. There is a kind of knowledge that no document can contain, not because it is too sensitive or too classified or protected by any of the legal architecture that has kept the secrets of Groom Lake from the public record for 70 years, but because it exists in a form that documents were never designed to hold, in the particular weight of a memory, in the specific texture of an experience, in the way a man's voice changes when he talks about something that happened 40 years ago in a place that the rest of the world did not know existed. This kind of knowledge lives in people. And people, unlike documents, do not last forever. The men and women who built Area 51, who flew its aircraft, maintained its engines, developed its technologies, cooked its meals and drove its vehicles and stood its security watches through the long Nevada nights, are aging. Some of them are already gone. And as they go, they take with them an irreplaceable layer of the historical record. Not the facts that appear in declassified documents, but the human texture of what it was actually like to live and work inside the most secret place in America, to carry that secret through an entire life, and to arrive at the end of that life with the question of what to do with it still unresolved. Some of them have talked, not all, and not fully, but enough to give the historical record something that the documents alone cannot provide: a sense of the human experience of the place, the daily reality of the extraordinary, the way that secrecy shapes not just what you say, but how you think and who you become over the years of carrying it. T.D. Barnes is one of those people. Barnes worked at Area 51 during the Cold War as a radar specialist, part of the technical infrastructure that supported the classified aircraft programs at Groom Lake. He has spent his later years as one of the most active and articulate voices among the community of former roadrunners, the name adopted by the Association of Area 51 veterans who have come together in the decades since the Cold War's end to share their experiences and preserve the history of what they did. What Barnes describes when he talks about the experience of working at the base is not the dramatic narrative of spy thriller fiction. It is something quieter and, in its own way, more interesting. He describes the community, the unexpected intimacy of a small group of people living and working in isolation, sharing meals and recreation in a place that the outside world did not acknowledge, developing the particular bonds that form when people are cut off from ordinary social life and thrown together by shared purpose and shared secrecy. He describes the pride, not the public, celebrated pride of a returning soldier or a recognized achievement, but the private, internal pride of knowing that what you are doing matters, that the work is real and consequential and difficult, even when no one outside the fence will ever know your name or what you contributed. He also describes the cost, the marriages that strained under the weight of unexplained absences and answers that could not be given to reasonable questions, the friendships that could not be maintained across the boundary of the clearance, because the person on the other side of that boundary could not be told where you were or what you were doing, and after a while the accumulation of things unsaid made the friendship into something different from what it had been. The children who grew up with a father who was away for weeks at a time, and who, when pressed, said only that he worked in the defense industry, somewhere in Nevada, doing something he could not discuss. These are not unusual stories in the context of classified work. They are the ordinary consequences of extraordinary secrecy, and they have been repeated in various forms by virtually everyone who has spoken about their time at Groom Lake. The secrecy was not incidental to the experience. It was constitutive of it. It shaped everything: the relationships, the self-understanding, the way time was experienced and memory was formed. To have worked at Area 51 was to have lived for the duration of that work, in a kind of parallel reality that ran alongside ordinary American life without touching it. And the people who lived in that parallel reality carry it with them in ways that do not fully resolve, even after the classification is lifted and the stories can finally be told. There are stories within this larger story that deserve to be told individually, because they carry within them something that the aggregate history cannot capture. There is the story of Kenneth Collins, one of the original A-12 pilots, who was flying a test mission in 1963 when his aircraft suffered a catastrophic failure and he was forced to eject. He came down by parachute in the Nevada desert, was found by civilians, and identified himself, as his training required, as a pilot from a U-2 program, a cover story designed to deflect attention from the aircraft he had actually been flying. The wreckage of the A-12 was recovered by a classified team before civilian authorities could examine it closely. Collins returned to flying, and the incident, which would in any other context have been a significant news story, disappeared into the classified record where it remained for decades. Collins could not tell his family what had happened. He could not acknowledge the aircraft he had been flying. He could not, in any public sense, account for the day he ejected from an aircraft that did not officially exist over a desert that was not officially there. There is the story of the families of pilots who died in accidents during classified test programs. The widows who received visits from men in suits who explained, with the careful language of official condolence, that their husbands had died in accidents involving aircraft that could not be described, in programs that could not be named, a location that could not be identified, who were given death certificates that listed causes and circumstances that bore only the most general relationship to what had actually happened, who were expected to grieve without context, to explain the loss to their children without explanation, and to carry the weight of an unacknowledgeable grief through the subsequent years of their lives. These are not small things. They are the human cost of institutional secrecy at its most absolute, and they sit uncomfortably alongside the genuine achievements that the secrecy was designed to protect. The U-2 and the A-12 and the F-117 are real achievements. The surveillance they provided, the intelligence they gathered, the military advantage they created, these things had real value in a dangerous world, and the people who created them understood that value and accepted the personal cost of the work in full awareness of what they were accepting. That does not mean the costs were not real. It does not mean they should be passed over in the accounting of what Area 51 produced. Among the former workers who have spoken most openly about the experience, there is a recurring theme that is worth dwelling on. It is the theme of recognition, specifically the hunger for it, and the complicated feelings that arise when it finally arrives. These are people who spent their careers doing work that was, by the standards of any reasonable assessment, extraordinary. Work that pushed the boundaries of what was aeronautically possible, that contributed to the security of their country during a period of genuine danger, that produced technologies whose descendants are still in use today. And they did this work in complete anonymity, not just at the time, but for decades afterward, while other achievements of the same era were celebrated and commemorated and entered into the public record with all the ceremony that significant achievement merits. When the A-12 pilots gathered at CIA headquarters in 2007 for the recognition event that the agency hosted, the response of those men to being acknowledged, officially on the record by the institution they had served, was in many cases deeply emotional. Some of them had been waiting for that acknowledgement for 40 years. Some of them wept. Some of them, by account of those present, seemed to physically change in the room, to shed something they had been carrying for so long that they had forgotten it had weight. The secrecy that had been a source of pride in their working years had become, over the decades of silence, something heavier and more complicated. Recognition did not erase it, but it transformed it into something more bearable. There is a particular detail from the oral histories of Groom Lake veterans that has stayed with many of the researchers and journalists who have collected them. It concerns the view from the aircraft. Multiple pilots, describing the experience of flying at extreme altitude above the Nevada desert, have used language that goes beyond the technical and into something closer to the philosophical. At 70,000 feet in AU-2, looking down at the curve of the Earth against the darkness of the upper atmosphere, or at 80,000 feet in an A-12 with the sky above gone nearly black and the horizon bent visibly by the planet's curvature. At those altitudes, several pilots have said, something happens to your sense of proportion. The smallness of the things you have left behind on the ground becomes very clear, and the largeness of what you are part of, the planet, the sky, the extraordinary fact of being a human being traveling at those speeds, at those heights in a machine that human beings have built from raw materials in mathematics, and relentless effort becomes briefly and overwhelmingly apparent. It is, they say, a perspective that you carry with you afterward, a recalibration that does not entirely reverse when the aircraft descends and the pressure suit comes off and the ordinary world reasserts itself. Something of the altitude stays with you. Something of the view from up there changes how the view from down here looks for the rest of your life. This is, perhaps, the most human thing about Area 51. Not the secrecy, and not the technology, and not the mythology that grew up around both, but the fact that real people went up there into that dark blue edge of the atmosphere and saw something that changed them, and came back down and lived their lives and kept their secrets and grew old, and now, at the end of those lives, are trying to find words for what it was like, before the words are gone with them, before the last person who was actually there is gone too, and all that remains is the documents and the declassified histories and the mythology that filled the spaces where the truth could not go. The truth is in those people, is leaving the world a little at a time, with each of them, and the desert, which was there before any of them, and will be there long after all of them are gone, keeps its own counsel about what it has witnessed, as it always has, as it always will. There is a date that serves in the recent history of the conversation about unidentified aerial phenomena as a kind of before and after, a line drawn across the calendar that separates the era in which the subject was treated by mainstream institutions and serious journalists and credentialed scientists as the province of enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists and the occasionally unhinged, from the era in which those same institutions and journalists and scientists began, with varying degrees of reluctance and discomfort, to treat it as something else entirely, something that deserved, at minimum, to be taken seriously, something that might, in the end, require an answer that none of the available frameworks were quite equipped to provide. That date is December 16th, 2017. And what happened on that date was the publication in the New York Times of a story that would not have appeared in that particular newspaper in that particular form at any earlier point in the preceding several decades. The story reported the existence of a Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ADIP, which had been established in 2007 and had operated, largely in secret, until 2012, when its official funding ended. The program had been created to investigate reports of unidentified aerial phenomena encountered by military personnel, primarily naval aviators operating off aircraft carriers in the Pacific and Atlantic, and to assess whether those phenomena represented a threat to national security or an opportunity for technological exploitation, or both, or neither. The program had been funded, quietly and somewhat unusually, through the budget of then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada, a detail that connected it, at least geographically, to the state that had been at the center of the Area 51 mythology for 70 years. The Times story was accompanied by something that made it impossible to dismiss in the way that previous reporting on the subject had been dismissed. It was accompanied by video. Declassified footage captured by the targeting systems of United States Navy fighter aircraft, showing objects that behaved in ways that the pilots who encountered them found inexplicable. Objects that appear to have no visible means of propulsion, that moved at speeds and with accelerations that exceeded what any known aircraft could achieve, that seemed to interact with the environment, with the ocean surface below, with the aircraft pursuing them, in ways that suggested awareness rather than simply physics. 3 videos were released with the initial story. They were given informal names by the pilots who had encountered the phenomena they depicted: Gimbal, Go Fast, and the one that would become the most discussed and most analyzed, the Tic Tac. The Tic Tac encounter had occurred in November 2004, off the coast of Southern California, during training exercises conducted by the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group. Commander David Fravor, a highly experienced Navy pilot with an impeccable service record, had been directed by his ship's radar operators to investigate an anomalous contact, something that the ship's sophisticated radar systems had been tracking for several days, appearing at high altitude and then descending rapidly to low altitude over the ocean before repeating the pattern. What Fravor found when he arrived at the location was an object he described as roughly the size and shape of a large tic-tac breath mint. White, elongated, with no wings, no visible propulsion system, no exhaust, and no markings. It was maneuvering above a patch of disturbed ocean water, hovering and moving in ways that Fravor, a man who had spent his career understanding what aircraft could and could not do, could not account for within any framework available to him. When Fravor attempted to approach the object, it accelerated away from him with a speed that he described as unlike anything he had seen in his career. It simply left. Within seconds, it had covered a distance that would have taken his aircraft considerably longer to traverse, and it was gone. Fravor returned to his carrier and reported what he had seen. His report was taken seriously by his superiors, investigated through whatever channels existed for such things at the time, and then filed away in the classified record where it remained for 13 years, until the Times story brought it to the surface. Fravor himself became, in the years following the Times story, one of the most credible and most visible public voices on the subject of UAP. Not because he claimed to know what he had seen. Precisely the opposite. Because he consistently and carefully declined to claim more than his experience supported, while maintaining with equal consistency that what he had seen was real, was extraordinary, and was not explicable by any conventional framework he was aware of. He was not saying it was extraterrestrial. He was saying it was unidentified, genuinely and completely, in a way that his training and experience had not prepared him for. The distinction mattered, and Fravor maintained it with a precision that the subject rarely receives. The release of the ADIP story and the accompanying videos did something to the public conversation about UAP that years of civilian research and testimony had not managed to do. It moved the subject, not completely and not without resistance, from the fringe toward the center. Not because the videos were conclusive. They were not, and serious analysts were quick to point out the limitations of what could be determined from targeting camera footage of uncertain provenance and technical specification, but because the source was unimpeachable in a way that previous evidence had not been. These were not blurry photographs taken by anonymous civilians. They were declassified military footage released by the Pentagon, accompanied by the testimony of credentialed military officers whose accounts had been filtered through 13 years of institutional processing before being made public. Congress, which had largely avoided the subject for decades with the particular avoidance that institutions practice when they sense that a topic carries more risk than reward, began to engage. Slowly at first, and then with increasing seriousness as the political and institutional calculus shifted. In 2020, the Senate Intelligence Committee included, in the Intelligence Authorization Act, a provision requiring the Director of National Intelligence to produce an unclassified report on UAP within 180 days. The report that resulted, released in June 2021, was 9 pages long, covered 144 incidents reported by military personnel between 2004 and 2021, and concluded, with a candor that would have been unthinkable in an official government document a decade earlier, that most of the incidents remained unexplained. The report did not say the phenomena were extraterrestrial. It did not say they were not. It said, with the careful language of an institution navigating genuinely uncertain territory, that the available data was insufficient to determine the nature or origin of most of the reported phenomena, that the phenomena appeared to represent real physical objects rather than sensor artifacts or perceptual errors in most cases, and that some of them demonstrated flight characteristics that were, in the precise language of the report, difficult to explain given current understanding of aeronautics and physics. It was a remarkable document, not because of what it claimed, but because of what it declined to dismiss. In the years since that report, the institutional engagement with UAP has continued to deepen. A permanent office dedicated to UAP investigation, eventually named the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or ARO, was established within the Department of Defense. Congressional hearings on the subject, which would have been almost unimaginable a decade earlier, became a recurring feature of the legislative calendar. Former intelligence officials made public statements that, while carefully worded, suggested that the phenomena being investigated were not fully accounted for by conventional explanations. And in 2023, a former intelligence officer named David Grush made claims before Congress, under oath, in a formal hearing with whistleblower protections, that went further than anything that had been said in an official setting before. Grush claimed that the United States government was in possession of non-human craft and non-human biological material, recovered from various locations over several decades, and that the programs managing these materials operated outside the normal oversight structures of the federal government, hidden not just from the public, but from most of Congress and most of the executive branch through a classification architecture so deep and so compartmentalized that it had effectively become invisible to the institutions nominally responsible for overseeing it. He claimed to have spoken with individuals who had direct knowledge of these programs. He claimed that people who had attempted to come forward with this information had been subjected to intimidation and in some cases physical threats. The response to Grush's testimony illustrated, with precision, exactly where the public conversation about these matters had arrived. His claims were treated seriously by the congressional committee before which he testified, not credulously, but seriously, with follow-up questions that engage with the substance of what he was saying rather than dismissing it as the product of confusion or bad faith. They were covered extensively by mainstream news organizations that would not have reported such claims in the same register at any earlier point. And they were met with official denials from the Pentagon, from the Director of National Intelligence, that were, by the assessment of many observers, notably less categorical than official denials on this subject had historically been. The denials said the claims were inaccurate. They did not say, with the flat certainty that official denials usually carry, that the programs Grush described did not exist. Whether any of this connects directly to Area 51 is a question without a publicly available answer. Grush did not specifically name Groom Lake as the location of the programs he described. His claims were about a broader, distributed architecture of compartmentalized programs spread across multiple facilities and contractors. But the conceptual connection was immediate and obvious to anyone familiar with the history, because the description of a program so deeply classified that it operated outside normal oversight, managed by a small group of insiders with extraordinary access and extraordinary secrecy, existing within the broader defense and intelligence establishment, but accountable to almost none of its normal structures, is a description that rhymes very closely with what Groom Lake was in its earliest years, and with what some researchers have argued it remains. The rhyme is not proof. Rhymes rarely are, but they are not nothing, either. They are the sound that history makes when it is trying to tell you something, and the something it is trying to tell you is that patterns recur, that institutions develop characteristic ways of handling certain kinds of information, and that the architecture of secrecy that was built in the Nevada desert in 1955 was not a one-time construction, but a template, a proof of concept for a particular approach to managing information that was subsequently applied in various forms to various programs in various places over the 7 decades that followed. That template is still in use. In what form, for what purposes, to what extent? These are the questions that the historical record cannot answer, and that the mythology has been trying to answer in its own way and with its own methods for as long as the secret has existed. The sky over Nevada is very large and very dark at night. The stars are close in the way that they are only close when you are far from city lights in the high desert, with nothing between you and the atmosphere's edge but a few miles of cooling air. People still drive out there on the extraterrestrial highway and pull over and stand beside their cars and look up. They're looking for something. Most of them could not tell you precisely what. Something that moves when it should be still. Something that is there and then is not. Something that raises, in the specific darkness of that specific sky, the oldest and most persistent question that the place has always asked. What is up there that we do not know about? The desert does not answer. It never has. And in that silence, the question lives on, as alive and as unanswered as it was on the first morning that a silver aircraft lifted from the pale surface of Groom Lake and climbed toward a sky that had never held anything like it before. There is a question that sits underneath all of the history we have covered in this journey. Underneath the aircraft and the pilots and the Cold War missions and the mythology and the congressional hearings and the desert silence that connects all of it. It is not a question about alien spacecraft, though that question is in there somewhere. It is not a question about stealth technology or reconnaissance programs or the specific capabilities of specific aircraft, though those questions are in there too. It is a deeper question, and it is one that Area 51, more than almost any other place or institution in modern American life, forces into the open simply by existing. The question is this: what is the appropriate relationship between a democratic government and the people it governs, with respect to the things that government does in secret? It is not a new question. It is, in some form, as old as democratic theory itself. The tension between the transparency that democracy requires to function legitimately and the secrecy that security sometimes genuinely demands. Every democracy that has ever existed has had to navigate this tension, and none of them has resolved it cleanly, because it does not have a clean resolution. It is only a continuous negotiation, conducted imperfectly and under pressure, between competing values that are both real and both legitimate, and that do not, in the end, reduce to each other. Area 51 is, among other things, a 70-year case study in how that negotiation has been conducted in the United States. And what the case study reveals is instructive, not as a simple indictment or a simple vindication of the institutions involved, but as a nuanced portrait of a system trying to do genuinely difficult things under genuinely difficult conditions, succeeding in some respects and failing in others, and generating, as a byproduct of both the successes and the failures, consequences that its architects did not anticipate and could not have controlled. The successes are real and significant. The U-2 program provided intelligence about Soviet military capabilities at a moment when the United States genuinely did not know whether the Soviet Union was ahead in the development of nuclear delivery systems, and when that uncertainty had direct consequences for the decisions that the most powerful governments on Earth were making about the risk of war. The intelligence the U-2 provided, specific, detailed, photographic intelligence of a quality that no other collection method could have produced, reduced that uncertainty in ways that almost certainly made the world safer. The A-12 extended that capability at a moment when Soviet surface-to-air missiles had rendered the U-22 vulnerable for Soviet overflights. The stealth programs that followed changed the nature of air warfare in ways that have, by the assessment of serious military analysts, reduced the cost and lives of certain kinds of military operations by making it possible to strike specific targets with a precision and impunity that carpet bombing and conventional air campaigns could not achieve. These are not trivial achievements. They are not achievements that should be dismissed or minimized in the accounting of what Area 51 produced. The people who created them, who flew the missions and built the aircraft and maintained the engines and developed the technologies, did so in service of genuine national security requirements, under conditions of genuine personal sacrifice, with a seriousness of purpose that the historical record, now that more of it is available, confirms. The failures are also real, and they are different in kind from the successes. They are not failures of technology or of operational execution. They are failures of the relationship between the institution and the public it was supposed to serve. The workers who were exposed to toxic chemicals at Groom Lake and who could not get adequate medical treatment because their doctors could not access the classified information about what they had been exposed to. That is a failure. The families of pilots killed in classified accidents who could not grieve with full knowledge of what had happened or full acknowledgement from the country their husbands and fathers had served. That is a failure. The UFO reports that accumulated for decades without any official effort to correct the record, leaving millions of people with a genuinely false impression of what they had witnessed, because correcting the impression would have required acknowledging programs whose acknowledgement was deemed too costly. That is a failure, and a particularly consequential one, because it seeded a culture of suspicion that has proved extraordinarily durable. The culture of suspicion that Area 51 helped to generate did not stay contained within the specific question of what happens at a classified base in Nevada. It spread. It became a generalized disposition toward official explanations, a reflexive skepticism about government accounts of anything unusual, an automatic assumption that what the public is being told and what is actually true are two different things, a comfort with explanatory frameworks that place hidden actors and concealed information at the center of events. This disposition is not irrational, given the history. The government did lie, repeatedly and systematically, about the existence of a facility that had operated for decades. The instinct to question official explanations of unusual phenomena has been validated, in the specific case of Groom Lake, by the subsequent revelation that the official explanations were false. The problem is that the validation of the instinct in one domain does not tell you which other domains it applies to. It simply makes the instinct more powerful, and a powerful instinct without reliable calibration is a tool that can cut in many directions. This is perhaps the most lasting and most complex legacy of Area 51. Not the technology, not the intelligence gathered, not even the mythology, but the contribution it made to a broader epistemological shift in American culture. The shift from a default posture of trust in institutions toward a default posture of suspicion. The shift was not caused solely by Area 51, of course. The same decades that built and sustained Groom Lake also produced the Pentagon Papers, Watergate, the Church Committee revelations about CIA assassination programs and domestic surveillance, the Iran-Contra affair, and a succession of other episodes in which the gap between official accounts and actual events was revealed to be large and consequential. Area 51 was one thread in a much larger fabric, but it was a thread that ran through the middle of the fabric, visible from the beginning to the end, connecting the early Cold War to the present day in a continuous line. What does that line look like from where we stand now? It looks in some ways like progress. The 2013 acknowledgement of the base's existence, however limited and however long delayed, represents a genuine movement toward transparency that did not exist in 1955 or 1965 or 1975. The declassification of the U-2 and Oxcar programs has given historians and the public access to a record of genuine achievement that deserves to be part of the shared account of what the United States did during the Cold War. The congressional engagement with UAP that began in 2020 represents, whatever its ultimate conclusions, a willingness to take seriously a category of phenomena that official institutions had previously refused to acknowledge as worthy of serious investigation. These are not nothing. They are the slow, imperfect, incomplete movement of institutions toward greater accountability, driven by a combination of legal pressure, journalistic persistence, political will, and the simple passage of time. And yet the line also looks, from where we stand, like continuity. The base is still there. The Janet flights still run. The perimeter is still absolute. The programs currently underway at Groom Lake are as opaque to public scrutiny as the U-2 program was in 1956, and they will remain so until some future declassification process makes them available to some future researcher who will write some future account of what was happening behind the wire in the 2020s. The architecture of secrecy that was built in the Nevada desert is intact. It has evolved, adapted, incorporated new technologies for maintaining its integrity in an age of commercial satellites and internet connectivity and freedom of information litigation. But it has not been dismantled, and there is no credible prospect that it will be. This is not necessarily a counsel of despair. Secrecy is not inherently illegitimate. The United States genuinely has adversaries who would benefit from knowing the specific capabilities and limitations of its most advanced military systems. And the case for keeping those capabilities classified is a real case, made by serious people for serious reasons. The argument is not that secrecy should be abolished, but that it should be bounded, that the classification system should be subject to meaningful oversight, that the default should be toward eventual disclosure rather than permanent concealment, that the people who bear the personal costs of the system's operation should be protected and acknowledged and cared for, and that the public whose trust is being asked for in exchange for the right to keep secrets should be given the minimum information necessary to make an informed assessment of whether that trust is being well placed. These are arguments that have been made in various forms by oversight advocates and classification reform specialists for decades. They have produced some results: stronger FOIA law, more robust congressional oversight mechanisms, improved whistleblower protections, accelerated declassification review processes. They have not produced a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between classified programs and public accountability. Perhaps they never will. Perhaps the nature of the security environment makes such a restructuring genuinely impossible. Perhaps it is simply that institutions with the power to resist change tend to do so, and the institutions that manage America's classified programs have that power in abundance. What Area 51 leaves us with, as a 70-year story coming to whatever provisional conclusion a story like this can have, is a set of unresolved tensions that are themselves part of the story. The tension between genuine achievement and genuine harm, between legitimate secrecy and corrosive dishonesty, between the obligations of a democratic government to its citizens and the obligations of a security state to its mission, between the human cost of secrecy, paid by the workers and pilots and their families, and the national security benefit that the same secrecy was designed to protect, between the mythology that secrecy generates and the truth that the mythology obscures and sometimes, paradoxically, points toward. These tensions do not resolve. They coexist, as they have always coexisted, in the specific geography of a dry lake bed in the Nevada desert, surrounded by mountains that keep their silence, under a sky that is very large and very dark at night, and that has held, over the decades, more of humanity's secrets and more of humanity's questions than almost any other patch of sky on Earth. The people who built this place are mostly gone now, or going. The aircraft they build are in museums, or still flying in upgraded forms, or classified and unknown. The mythology they inadvertently helped to create is as alive as it has ever been, evolving with each new disclosure and each new silence, finding new forms and new audiences in each generation that encounters the story for the first time. And the base itself, real, acknowledged, coordinates on a map, Janet flights running on schedule, continues its work in the tradition of everything that came before it. Whatever that work is, whatever it has always been, the desert knows. And the desert, as it has done since a small aircraft first circled over a pale lake bed on a spring afternoon in 1955, is not saying. There is a tradition among the people who have spent their lives studying this place. The researchers and historians and journalists who have devoted years or decades to the patient, partial, often frustrating work of trying to understand what has happened at Groom Lake, of making a pilgrimage, not to the base itself, which remains as inaccessible as it has ever been, but to the places around it, to the boundary line where the warning signs stand in the desert sun, to the hilltops from which the valley can be seen at a distance as a collection of pale shapes against the darker desert floor, to the little ale inn in Rachel, where the walls are covered in photographs and newspaper clippings and the accumulated memorabilia of a mythology that has been building for longer than most of its current enthusiasts have been alive, to the stretch of the extraterrestrial highway that runs past the old mailbox, replaced now, the original having been taken so many times by souvenir hunters that the rancher eventually gave up replacing it with the same kind and installed something more robust, where people still pull over and stand at the edge of the road and look toward the mountains and feel whatever it is that this place makes people feel. What it makes people feel is worth taking seriously, because it is not a simple thing. It is not purely the thrill of proximity to mystery, though that is part of it. It is not purely the satisfaction of participating in a shared cultural narrative, though that is part of it too. There is something else underneath those things, something that the place itself seems to generate, independent of whatever is or is not happening behind the wire, independent of whether the mythology is true or false or something in between. Something that has to do with the specific experience of standing at the edge of what you are permitted to know and looking toward what you are not. That experience is, in a way, a concentrated version of something that all of us live with all the time. We are all, always, standing at the edge of what we are permitted to know and looking toward what we are not. There are things happening in the world, in the institutions that govern us, in the organizations that shape our lives, in the processes that determine the conditions of our existence, that we do not have access to and may never have access to. This is not paranoia. It is simply the condition of living in a complex society with complex institutions, some of which operate for reasons that range from entirely legitimate to entirely self-serving, in varying degrees of opacity. Area 51 is that condition made visible, made geographic, given coordinates and a perimeter and warning signs and a name. That is why it persists. Not because the mythology is necessarily true. Some of it is, most of it probably is not, and the parts that might be true remain genuinely unresolved. But because the mythology addresses something real, it addresses the feeling of not knowing, the feeling of being kept from information that bears on your understanding of the world, the feeling that somewhere behind some wire or some classification stamp or some bureaucratic wall. There's a truth that would change the picture if you could only get to it. Area 51 gives that feeling a home, a specific address in the Nevada desert, accessible by a two-lane highway, surrounded by mountains that hold their silence and a sky that has held more secrets than most people will ever know. The story of this place is, in the end, many stories layered on top of each other. It is the story of the Cold War and the men who fought it from the edge of the atmosphere, in aircraft that should not have been possible, in service of a mission they believed in and a secrecy they accepted. It is the story of technology, of what human ingenuity can produce when it is freed from ordinary constraints and given sufficient resources and sufficient isolation and sufficient time. It is the story of mythology, of what happens when a secret becomes large enough and old enough and surrounded by enough silence that the human imagination begins to fill the space with its own creations that eventually take on a life independent of whatever truth they were originally trying to reach. It is the story of institutions, of how governments manage information, and what they choose to reveal and what they choose to conceal, and what the consequences of those choices are for the people they govern and for the culture that forms around the concealment. And it is underneath all of these larger stories, the story of people, of the engineers who stayed up through Nevada nights working on problems that had never been solved before, because they were the kinds of people who could not leave a problem unsolved, of the pilots who climbed into aircraft that were not fully understood and flew them to the edge of the possible, because they were the kinds of people who needed to know where the edge was, of the workers who maintained and supported and sustained the programs in the thousand unglamorous ways that keep any complex enterprise functioning, who drove the trucks and cooked the meals and stood the watches and carried their secrets home with them on the unmarked aircraft every Friday evening, of the families who waited, of the wives who raised children alone through the week and asked few questions, of the children who grew up with a father-shaped absence at the center of the week and learned early that some questions did not have answers. These people are the human substance of the story. The technology is remarkable, and the history is significant, and the mythology is fascinating. But the people are what make it matter in the way that things matter when they are connected to actual lives actually lived. And as those people age and pass, and the living connection to the earliest years of the base grows thinner and more fragile, there's an urgency to the work of recording and preserving what they have to say that the historical record increasingly recognizes, even when the classification system has not yet caught up. There are things we know now about Area 51 that we did not know 20 years ago. There are things we will know 20 years from now that we do not know today. Programs that will be declassified, personal accounts that will be recorded, documents that will be released through FOIA processes that are currently still working their way through the bureaucratic machinery. The historical record of this place is not complete. It is not close to complete. It is an ongoing project, shaped by the slow and imperfect movement of classification systems toward disclosure, by the willingness of former participants to speak, and by the patience of the researchers and journalists and historians who have made the pursuit of this particular truth their life's work. What we do not know, what we may never know, is the answer to the question that sits at the center of the mythology and refuses to be dislodged by anything that the factual record has so far been able to provide. Whether the extraordinary claims that have been made about this place, the recovered technology, the non-human materials, the programs operating outside all oversight structures, are true. Whether the genuine and documented history of remarkable human achievement at Groom Lake coexists with something else, something that would require a different kind of accounting entirely, something that would change not just the story of this place, but the story of what we are and where we are and what the universe we inhabit actually contains. That question is genuinely open. It is not closed by the declassified documents, which cover what they cover and are silent about the rest. It is not closed by the testimony of former workers, which is credible about what it addresses and unable to address what it does not. It is not closed by the congressional hearings and the UAP reports and the whistleblower testimony, which have moved the question from the fringe to the center of serious discussion without resolving it. It is not closed by the silence of the official record, which proves only that the official record is silent and not what the silence contains. It remains open. It will remain open until something closes it, until a disclosure is made, or a discovery confirmed, or an explanation provided that account for the full body of testimony and evidence in a way that no current explanation does. Whether that closing comes from within the classification system, through some future act of official transparency, or from outside it, through some development that the current situation does not allow us to anticipate, is itself unknown. What we can say with confidence and with the support of the historical record that is available is that Area 51 is one of the most remarkable places that the 20th century produced. That what happened there, what is documented and declassified and confirmed, represents an achievement of human ingenuity and institutional commitment and personal courage that deserves to be known and celebrated and studied. That the secrecy which surrounded those achievements, while in some respects necessary and in other respects excessive and harmful, produced consequences that are still working themselves out in the culture and the politics and the epistemology of the present day. And that the questions the place raises about secrecy and transparency, about what governments are the people they govern, about the boundaries of what human beings have achieved and what they may yet discover, are not going away. They are, if anything, growing more pressing. In a world where the gap between what institutions know and what the public is permitted to know has never been wider, and where the tools available for both concealment and revelation have never been more powerful, the specific history of a classified base in the Nevada desert is more than a Cold War story. It is a map of a terrain that we are all still navigating. The base exists. The work continues. The sky over Nevada is very large and very dark and very full of things we do not yet have names for. And somewhere in that sky, on any given night, something is flying that the rest of us have not been told about. Whether it was built by human hands, in the tradition of everything that Kelly Johnson and his team began on the floor of that Nevada desert in 1955, or whether it represents something else entirely, something that would require us to reconsider everything we think we know about what we are and what we are not alone in. That question belongs to the future. This story belongs to all of it, to the past that built the place, to the present that is still trying to understand it, and to the future that will one day, in ways we cannot yet predict, finally see what is behind the wire. Until that day, the desert holds what it holds. The mountains keep their silence, and the pale surface of Groom Lake, baked white by a sun that has been rising over it for longer than any secret has ever been kept, waits with the patience that only the truly ancient can manage for the next aircraft, the next program, the next chapter in a story that has never really had an ending. Only a horizon, always moving, always just out of reach. This concludes our journey through the history and mysteries of Area 51. As a reminder, if you're looking for ways to naturally relax and sleep, have a look at some resources in the description below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again, and have a good night.